Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Kamma daf Samach. This month's learning is sponsored by Tzipora Shwat in loving memory of Liba Bat Chaim. And this week's learning is sponsored by Tamar Warba. Okay, we're going to get started with the Mishnah. The Mishnah that we saw, we're just going to go through the first part of the Mishnah that we saw in Daf Nun Tet. We have someone who sends a fire, something. We don't know exactly what, and that's going to be the debate Reish, Lakish, and Rabbi Yochanan, if you remember from Daf Kaf Bet. If you give this fire to a shoteh katan that doesn't know how to watch it properly, when we talked about, for example, if you give them animals to watch and they mess up, well, it's your fault. But somehow with the fire, we're going to say it's their fault. And you don't get blamed for it. Okay, now you don't get blamed if you're, again, we talked about this, only b'dinei adam in a court of law, whereas you are liable in a court, a heavenly court, meaning you're not fully scot-free. So now comes Reish Lakish and says in the name of Chizkiah, I'm going to start from the Gemara, what kind of fire are we talking about that you passed on? And Rashi is going to say this is based on Reish Lakish's approach in general, that Ishom Mishum, okay, we had a whole machlok at what is fire? Is it fire because it's something you created, like your animals, your property? And that's what Reish Lakish holds. Fire, you're liable because it's your property. So therefore, he says, it's only that you gave him a coal. A coal doesn't spread unless you fan the fire and create a fire out of it. So, right, if you've ever done an ad hoc barbecue, and you have to basically fan the coals to get the fire going. So if you give him a hot coal that basically can't really light on fire unless you fan it, then you're going to be exempt. But if you made the fire, then it's your fire, basically. And of course, you're going to be liable for it if you gave it to someone to protect who doesn't know how to protect it, because fire is like your property. So just like you give an ox to someone who, doesn't, and they end up watching and not doing a very good job and the ox damages, same thing here. It's your fault because you gave it to someone who doesn't know how to watch it properly. But if it's a gachelet and they did the act of creating the fire from it, well, then, of course, that's not your fault. Again, not your fault. It's somewhat your fault. You shouldn't have given it, right? Don't let kids play with fire. But it wasn't really fire. It was something that could turn into fire. So therefore, we can't make you liable because we're missing an action there. You didn't really do something that was wrong enough that we can make you liable. And then my time a masav kargarmulo, because it's the other person's actions that caused it to happen. So we can't blame you. Rabbi Yochanan, if you remember, now again, Rashi connects it. The Gemara doesn't connect it, but Rabbi Yochanan says there in the earlier sugya that we saw that ishom mishum chitzav. It's because of your arrows, meaning it's your direct actions that cause the fire. It's not because it's your property; it's because of your action. So because of that, Rabbi Yochanan says, afilu masar lo shalhevet patur. Even if you gave him a shalhevet, in the end, it's the action. What's the important thing? Not the fire itself. It's the spreading of the fire. Who spread the fire? My time. It was the person, the shoteh katan, that spread the fire. You didn't spread the fire. So because of that, you're not liable, even if you gave them a torch. Below mechayev, you'd only be chayev ad sheyimsor lo gavza v'silta v'shraga. You're only going to be liable when you give him the thorns. We're going to get back to the thorns and how the thorns were how they kind of created the fire, united the fire with that, and then the twigs. That's how you build a fire. And the candle. Now, this seems a little bit strange because you're just giving him raw materials. In the end, he's the one who makes the fire. So it seems a little odd. The Tosfot Reed asked that question, and the Tosfot Reed explains, back on the Sugya and Daf Kaf Bet, explains that what's really going on here is that you must have given him the whole thing already, kind of like saying instead of giving him a torch, which is like a single flame, but you actually gave him a bonfire. Okay, you put it all together, the fire, the twigs, the thorns, and you gave him something that was really going to spread right away. And basically, he didn't really do anything. A wind came, blew the fire, and you did everything, which makes a lot more sense. Otherwise, it's very hard to understand this line. Dahu v'daima didei garme, because in that case, it's clearly your actions that caused this to happen, and not the other thing. Oh, by the way, that reminds me of your question, Becky. Right, it's different than pushing the grain toward the fire because that's grama. This is you're actually giving him the fire, and then a wind comes, blows it, and that's it. I said at the end of class, someone asked, "Is this part of the 4 cases?" And I said, "Yes, it's not part of the 4 cases. The 4 cases, right, where this is all you're liable in the court of law. You're not liable in a court of law, but you are liable in a heavenly court. I got mixed up. It's not one of the four cases. It's one of the later, right after they quoted the four cases, the bride with the four cases, which didn't mention this one. The Gemara says, well, what about this one and that one and that one? And ours is one of the cases. It said, why don't you mention our case? So it actually wasn't in the brides in the four cases, but it is listed there in that sugya as one of these cases of the examples of Chayav b'dinei Adam and, I'm sorry, Patur b'dinei Adam, you're exempt, but liable in the heavenly court. So now we're back to a line in the Mishnah, and they're actually quoting this line, Shalach b'yad pikeach pikeach chayav, but they're really dealing with the last line, which is liba, right? If you, sorry, I'm looking for it. Echad ba'achir v'liba, if somebody else came and they fanned the flame and fanned the coals and turned it into a fire, then hamelabeh chayav, which by the way goes exactly with what we just said. Now, what they don't tell you here, but it's obvious, and if you look in the Yerushalmi and the Tosefta, you'll see there's different versions here of our Mishnah. Some versions said liba, which is to fan the coals, and some said niba. So the Gemara's Amar of Nachman bar Yitzchak, mandatani liba lo mishtabesh, umandatani niba lo mishtabesh. Both those versions work, okay? You're not mistaken if you use the liba version, and you're not mistaken if you use the niba version. And now we're going to show what the etymology of both these words are. Mandatani liba lo mishtamesh, dechtiv bilibat esh. Okay, and there the liba goes with the fire, and there you see that liba has to do with fire and fanning the fire. Umandatani niba lo mishtamesh, dechtiv borei niv sfatayim. Now this has nothing to do with fire. It means is God creates, right, the words that come out of people's mouths. Now niv sfatayim, the niv is the breath that comes out of a person, and that's where your breath, in a sense, is like a wind that could fan the flames, and from there they get to the theoretically that could also mean to fan the flames. Okay, that's a side point. Now we're going to go back to the tochen, the content. Libta haruach kulam pturim. Tanu Rabbanan. Liba v'libta haruach. What if? So it says here that if the wind caused it, and this I ended with quickly yesterday. Was always at the end. It's a little bit rushed. The end of yesterday's class, we talked about this line in the Mishnah, which said basically, if you had a coal, but then, okay, and then we had the fire and the wood, and someone brought the fire, someone brought the wood. But if it didn't really turn into a fire, but, right, kind of, they become coals when you do that, and then it was kind of dying out and came a wind and it fanned it, then you're basically not going to be liable because the wind turned it into a fire. And then we had a whole debate. Was it a regular wind, an atypical or typical wind? And that was what the commentaries discussed, which come to different halachic conclusions, whether you say it's only, can a typical wind, since we expect typical winds, usually a typical wind is liable if, let's say, I have a fire here and I didn't contain it and a wind comes and blows it over there. If it's typical wind, I'm liable. But here we're not talking about the fire spreading. We're talking about creating the fire in the first place. For that, it might not be enough you might not be liable if a typical wind created the fire. You actually have to create the fire and the typical wind spreads it. Then you'll be liable. But if the typical wind created the fire, maybe you won't be liable. That's a machloka between the commentaries here. What kind of wind? That's a side point. Let's stick with what the Gemara is talking about. So now the Gemara brings a braita. So here it's clear, though, if a wind, whether it's typical or atypical, fanned the flames and you didn't, and the coal wouldn't have turned into flames otherwise, then you're exempt. So comes the braita and says, liba v'libta haruach. Well, what if it was a combined thing? You were fanning the flames and the wind came and fanned it with you. So it depends. If you could have fanned it yourself and you would have gotten it going without the wind, then you're liable. But if not, if you needed the wind to do it, you wouldn't have been able to do it on your own. Patur. Okay, they don't get into how we assess this. Okay, but let's just assume you can assess that. Then you'd be exempt. Amai. Now they ask a big question. We're going to have 4 different answers to this question. Lihavi kizoreh v'ruach masayato. One of the avot malachot is zoreh. That's winnowing. Now, what do you do when you winnow? You use this big pitchfork. You throw up you have the wheat and the chaff. After you separate the wheat from the chaff and the grains, you throw it all up in the air. You have these, right? The chaff is very, very light. The wind blows the chaff aside and you end up with a pile of grains of wheat. So what happens there? If you're zoreh, now usually you need the wind. It doesn't really work unless the wind blows the chaff away. If there's no wind, it's not going to work so well. So it's like zoreh with the ruach helping you. Without the wind, you couldn't have done this melacha. And yet you're obviously obligated because zoreh is a malacha and you're going to be liable for zoreh, even though you can't really do it on your own. So Amar Abaye, we're now going to have 4 answers, as I said. 3 are going to be what we call ukimtot. It's going to say that's only in, this braita that said if you do it together with the wind and you couldn't have done it on your own, then you're going to be exempt. When are we going to exempt you? Because really we learned from Shabbat that you and the wind together, you really are liable. But in this case, it was different. Okay, that's going to be the gist of the first 3. The 4th one, I think, is the most interesting. It's going to distinguish between Hilchot Shabbat and Hilchot Nezikin, which is always more interesting because it's kind of a zoom out. Like, let's look at how Shabbat works, how Nezikin works. Okay, and that they're totally different, but that's going to be our last one. The first 3 are going to be Ukimtot and saying, well, you're really only exempt if the following happens. So Abaye says, you're fanning it one way. The wind is fanning it the other way, and the fire spreads in the direction of the wind and not the direction that you were fanning. So there, you can clearly blame the wind. But if you were both fanning in the same direction, you were blowing it this way, and the wind blew it that way also, and the fire spread that way, then you're going to be liable. You were fanning with a wind that was typical. The typical wind, right? That would have done one thing, but the ruach came this big tornado and flew, like took the wind and took the fire, and it really made it happen. Then you're not liable because it was a ruach she'ena mitzuya. You shouldn't have expected that was going to happen, and therefore you're going to be exempt. Rabbi Zera amal kigon dit samrat simure. Okay, what is samrat simure? So we say it's that you breathed on it. And Rashi explains that when you breathe, right, your breath is hot and you were trying to fan it with your breath. Now Rashi says, ein ze liboy klal. Okay, that's not really liboy. You can't really do that. It's not going to be very effective, and that's why you're going to be exempt. So in all these cases, they're basically saying it was a unique situation, but actually under normal circumstances, you'd be liable just like a Masechet Shabbat. But Rav Ashi Amar, that's just for Shabbat. Why? You might remember, we've had this a bunch of times in our Masechet. If you don't remember it from Masechet Shabbat, in our Masechet, we talked about all sorts of damages. Remember, Rava gave all those cases and said, what's it for Shabbat? What's it for this? And because you didn't have proper intent, right? The whole idea was Nizikin, doesn't matter your intent. But when it comes to Shabbat, it matters your intent. And because it's Melechet Machshevet, what do we say? Melechet Machshevet Asrat Torah, it has to be, you had to have intended it, and the what came out has to be what you intended. And in the previous cases we saw it actually exempted you, right? Because you didn't intend it, so you're exempt. Whereas in Nezikin, we don't care what your intent is. You did it, you're liable. Here we're going to do the reverse. We're actually going to say you're actually liable for something in Shabbat because of Melechet Machshevet and exempt for Nezikin. So what's the issue here? Melechet Machshevet Asrat Torah means there's each action is associated with a particular intent. So when you do winnowing, the whole idea is you do one action and you expect the wind to come and blow the chaff out of the way, and you're going to end up with your pile of wheat. So when you do that, even though the wind is helping you, it's all about what you intended. Your intent was that you'd end up with this pile of wheat, and that's what happens. So what if the wind helped you? You did an action of winnowing, and then the wind came and helped you, and in the end, you have your intended result. So you're going to be liable because Melechet Machshevet Asrat Torah, you got what you wanted, even though you didn't fully do it yourself. But in Nezikin, it's all about your action. Now, what's the problem with your action here? Well, your action is missing something because you didn't do the action directly. It was the wind that did it, really. So, Aval Hacha Grama Ba'almahu Ugrama B'Nezikin Patul. This is indirect action because you were fanning it, but the wind came and took it from there. That means it's grama. You did one thing, which caused another thing, which caused it to happen. But you're missing an action because you didn't do the action directly, and you're only liable, even though you're liable, even if you didn't intend, but you're liable only as long as there was an action. And this action is missing something. So in this case, it's going to be the reverse. We're actually going to be more lenient when it comes to Nezikin than we are with Shabbat. Okay, so that was 4 answers as to why this is not the same as winnowing. The first 3 really agreed it is the same. It's just they said this must be a unique case where something else happened here and where it's clear that the wind is more at fault than you are. But the last one says, no, it's you and the wind, but because it's indirect in the end and you're missing an action, we're not going to make you liable. New Mishnah. but still the same topic. Hasholech et be'era va'achla etzim o avanim o afal. If it devoured trees, and not just crops. Until now, we were talking about a gadish, right, a pile of grains or something. But it ate a tree, it consumed a tree, or it blackened stones, or it ruined dirt, like it just caused the ground to be blackened. Chayav, you're liable. Shenemal. Now, this is interesting. Usually in a Mishnah, you don't get psukim. Usually in a Mishnah, you just get the law. Here, they're connected to the pasuk, even though they don't exactly explain how it's all connected to the pasuk. We'll see that in the Gemara. Shenemal ki tetzei esh u'mitza'ah kotzim, and it finds, this is the pasuk, when a fire goes out and it finds thorns, v'ne'echal gadish, and a pile of grains get eaten, o hakama, or a standing grains, o hatzadeh, or a field, shalem v'shalem hamavir et be'era. So all those words are going to basically include etzim, avanim, and afar. We're going to see that soon. Amarav. So first, the Rava wants to know, why did this pasuk have to say ne'echal gadish or hakama or right all these things? Why does it have to say kutzim? Okay, lama li t'kadav rachmana kutzim, gadish, kama, and sadeh. Why are those four terms mentioned in the pasuk? What does each one add? Tzricha. You need them all. If it just said thorns, I would have thought, now thorns, as I said before, when the person brings the thorns, you're going to be liable, because the thorns are what usually ignite a fire with, and therefore thorns are the first go-to of a person who wants to create a fire. So therefore, they're the most common case. So and if I want to make a fire, I'll go to my neighbor's yard, I'll take their kutzim, and I'll light a fire with them. Because you use them to light your fire, they're the most common, and therefore the most likely you're going to be negligent here and use someone else's when you want to put a fire together. But most people don't go over and light a pile of grains up on fire. It's not a typical thing. And because it's uncommon that you're negligent about it, maybe we won't make you liable. And that's why you had to say no also gadish, because in the end you destroyed someone's property through fire. If it just said gadish, you would have thought havamina gadish chayav rachmana mishum dehavse merubahu. This is a very strange havamina. We'll talk about in a minute, right? Where the Gemara is going to say you would have thought. Why would you have thought this? But there's a huge loss because it's all the person's grains that they just collected. Aval kotzim dehavse muat emalo. But if it's thorns, it's not a big loss. Maybe we won't make you liable for them. We'll say, you took something that wasn't worth a lot of money. We won't make you pay. It's a little bit strange to think. Just because, right, you would think if I destroy anything of yours, I should have to pay. It doesn't matter if it's $2 or $100 or $1,000, right? I should have to pay. But this seems to imply you might have thought maybe it's worth so little that maybe I don't need to pay. So that explains the first two words, gadish and kutzim. Kamma lamali, what about the kamma, the standing grains? Ma kamma begaloi, af kol begaloi. And this teaches us that it has to be out in the open. Remember, we learned that tamun is exempt. If something's hidden, you don't pay for fire. It was one of those unique things about fire we saw at the beginning of the Masechet. Although there's a machloket about it. So now we're going to have a ping pong because Rabbi Yehuda de Mechayev Anitzke Tamun Beish, but he thinks Tamun is liable. So what's he going to do with Kamma? Kamma lamali, and then he's going to say something, and then we'll say, well, where the rabbis learned that from? And then what does he do with that? And back and forth. Kamma lamali l'rabot koba alei koma. Kamma comes to teach you it's not just standing grains, but anything that stands, like a tree or like an animal that stands up. So anything that stands, okay, you'll also be liable for, not just grains that are in the field. Rabbanan, so where the rabbis learn that from, because obviously you're liable for those as well. Because it says or is a word that we can say adds. Rabbi Yehuda, so Rabbi Yehuda doesn't need the o for that because he learns it from Kamma. So what does he do? O comes to teach you, like we saw with Shiur, and Shiur o chamor in the boar case. Right? Nafal sham ashur o chamor. What was the o for? To say, it's not that ashur and chamor has to fall in for you to be liable. No, even one of them. Same thing here. O comes to teach you this or that. Not that all of these have to be burned in order for you to be liable. Again, strange to think that you would even think that would be the case, that you'd only be liable unless all of it happens. But that's what you need the o for. It's just really just the simple meaning of the word or. That's what or means. Well, the rabbis use O to teach you the animal, right? Anything that stands, the trees. So where does he learn l'chalek from? He doesn't have the O free for that. Well, there's two O's in the pasuk. Nafkalemi O hasadeh, because it says O hakama O hasadeh. From there we can learn One is lechalek, and one is to teach you, right, one is for, sorry, I got confused for a second, right, one is bale koma, and one is for lechalek. For Rabbi Yehuda, what does he do with the two O's? He's going to do nothing with them. And that's going to be okay because I did katav rachmana o kamma katav o sadeh. Once it said or the standing grains, well, then the next thing had to be also o sadeh, and it's just to make it match in the pasuk. And you don't really learn anything from it. The last word we're left to darshan is sadeh. Why does it say field? We already know things in the field. We just discussed that. Kotzim, we discussed the gadish, the pile. So why do you need another word of sadeh? That's what came up in the Mishnah. If you plowed the field and now you just burn the field, right? There's nothing in it. It's just freshly plowed, or you charred the stones, then you're still liable for that because it happens to be in the field. So the Gemara says, well, then we could have just been much simpler. Could have just written field, and then we would have known things standing in the field, things right, and the stones and the plowed field. You would have kind of gotten everything. It's a catch-all phrase, to which they say no, because this is the way the drashot often work. If you didn't have all the other words, you would have said sadeh goes to what grows in the fields, and then you wouldn't have known animals, and you wouldn't have known, right? You wouldn't have known stones or plowed field, because you would have said maybe it's only things growing in the field. Once you already had other words that taught all those other things, the only thing left for the word sadeh is to include other things in addition, which is a plowed field and the charred stones. So that's how we learn it in the end from hasadeh. Okay, so that was a drasha, those 4 words, what we got from each of them. Now we're going to get off into agadata for the rest of today, mostly. And I would say this really touches close to home the topics we're going to encounter today, which is really the broader topic of tzaddik viralo, okay, where bad things happen to good people, and tzaddikim get killed in the midst of, we'll see, puranut. And we're going to discuss how to relate to I'm going to suggest some possible ways to how to relate to these sources. Okay, with that introduction, we'll get started. And you'll see in a minute why this is connected to here, because they're going to darshan this agadata, this statement, this first statement is going to come straight out of our pasuk about the fire. Amar Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmani amar Rabbi Yochanan. Ein puranut ba'a la'olam ela bizman sha'reshaim ba'olam. Puranut, bad things come to the world when there's evil people in the world. Okay, we'll see that it seems to be meaning here Jews who were not keeping, who are bad people. But when the puranut comes and the bad things come, they actually destroy the tzaddikim first. They get destroyed before the rishaim. Shenema, where do we get this from? And then we'll talk about what we do with this. Ki tetzei esh u'metza'ah kotzim. Now, it says, right, when the fire goes out and it finds thorns. Ematai esh yotza'ah. When does the fire go out? Bizman shekotzim mitzuima. Right? A fire can only be created when there's thorns that can easily light on fire, which means the puranut can only happen when there's rishaim who are easily burnt by the puranut. In other words, they're the ones who are the most deserving of the punishment. But it actually starts in really with the tzaddikim. Shene'emal v'ne'echal gadish. Now we're going to learn something strange about the wording of this pasuk. It says again, Ki tetzei esh. We're in Shemot Kaf Bet, chapter 22, verse. Hey, my eyes read correctly. Verse 5. Ki tetzei esh u'metza'ah kotzim. So when a fire goes out and it finds thorns, v'ne'echal gadish, and a pile of grains gets eaten. Now, it says ne'echal means it gets eaten. Now, it should say ve'achal gadish, right? A fire goes out, eats the kotzim, and then eats the gadish. That's what we assume. It first starts with the thorns, then it eats the pile of grains. To which they say no, but it says ne'echal. Ve'achal gadish lo ne'amar ala ve'ne'echal gadish, she'ne'echal gadish kvar. So this is basically a reference to the Jewish people getting burned, right? Like a bad thing happening. It's going to eat the kotzim, we'll get rid of the rishaim. But first, it's ne'echal gadish. The gadish was already eaten before, meaning the tzaddikim are going to die first. We're going to see the Gemara is going to give a bit of a reason for this, but before we get into that, I want to think about what the Gemara is doing here and why they're saying this. It's very hard for us, these statements, because it's like saying we know the ways of God and we know the way God works, which we don't, right? And it's hard to kind of swallow these sources and to know what we're supposed to do with them. So the Meiri has an interesting approach. I'll give you kind of two tracks of how to think about this. One is the Meiri says, the reason for the statement really is to explain to the tzaddikim that you can't just ignore the Rishaim and say, okay, well, there's me and there's them. And I can live in my world and they can live in their world and do what they want, because what they do affects me as well. And what it's really trying to do is, and again, the Gemara often makes these statements that seem like very, okay, we know how things work, but they're really trying to get a message across. And the message trying to get across, according to the Meiri, is you should rebuke the Rishaim in your time, because if you're a tzaddik, you should rebuke the people who are doing wrongdoings, because in the end, their actions are going to affect you as well, which makes a lot of sense in the world, right? We all know that everybody's actions affect everybody else. So that's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is really just saying that the rabbis don't necessarily mean take me literally in what I'm saying, but what they're doing is they're grappling with the same questions that we grapple with, the same questions that people have been grappling with forever, which is struggling with how do we fit this into a framework? We have tzaddikim who are dying. How can that be, right? And it's something we're all struggling with on a daily basis. How are these amazing young people dying when they have their whole lives ahead of them, and it doesn't make any sense to us? And they're struggling with exactly that question, and they're trying to find sources and explanations for it. It doesn't mean, oh, this explains it all. So like I'll give you another example. We talked about this in Masechet Shabbat, the Mishnah there. Right? Women die in childbirth because of 3 reasons. It's not why women die, right? It's that they saw this was a thing that was happening, that women were dying in childbirth, and they tried to come up with, let's try to connect it with something. And it doesn't mean, okay, you're going to do that, you're going to die. So they sound simplified, but they're not simplified. They're really getting to bigger, broader ideas of we're struggling with this. Some, by the way, explain it as why the tzaddikim get punished. As we know, we've seen this in a number of sources also, because they want to get right. They want to be, God wants to reward them in the olam haba. So he punishes them in this world so that they're already get to the next world without their sins on them. But again, that's a hard thing to swallow and to understand. How do we really view that? So, but that's another reason as to why the tzaddikim first. And we'll see the Gemara is going to bring another direction, but these are kind of ways that we can kind of grapple with these sugyas and view them particularly, perhaps in different ways that aren't, okay, this is the simple reading, this is the way it goes, because we know it doesn't always go this way. This isn't exactly, the world is not so simple, much more complex than these sources make it sound. And I think the rabbis knew that. I know the rabbis knew that. Okay, Tane Rav Yosef. So Rav Yosef brings a brighter. Now we're going to use this pasuk. This is going to connect with our other ideas. We're going to have 2 more sources to talk about the same, two more things that really talk about the same idea. But then we're going to get off on a tangent about this pasuk. This is a pasuk in Makapachorot, when God went to strike the first, or he sent an angel to strike the firstborn children in Mitzrayim. He told the Jews, do not leave your houses until the morning. Here we start getting to Rishaim of other nations, right? When the evil is out there to destroy, it doesn't distinguish between tzaddikim and Rishaim, and therefore stay in your houses, stay protected, he tells them. And we're going to use another pasuk to show that the tzaddikim often get hit first. This is a pasuk in Yechezkel, and he says, I'm going to destroy among you the tzaddikim and the tzaddik and the rasha, and the tzaddik comes first. Rav Yosef. So Rav Yosef responds and he starts crying. He says, Kulei hai nami la'ayin domim. I understand the tzaddikim become like nothing. It seems so unfair. Amalei Abai, right? You see, struggling with the same things we're struggling with. Amalei Abai, tivutu hu l'gabayu. So here's an explanation they give, possible way of looking at it. God is doing them a good deed. Why? Okay, here's a pasuk from Yeshayahu that explains it. Okay, the way they view it is because God wants to spare the tzaddikim seeing all the suffering that's going to come. He wants to spare them from either seeing the suffering or from suffering with the people. Okay, and better to take them before all the bad is going to befall. That's again another possible, right? They're trying to grapple with how can we view this whole idea. Again, without presuming to have all the answers, but they are making suggestions. Okay, now we're going back to that pasuk about don't leave your homes. Amar Rav Yehuda Amarav. So now we're going to Amabet. La'olam yikanes adam b'chi tov v'yitzeh b'chi tov. you should always leave. You should always go into your house when it's still light out and leave your house in the morning when it's light out already. Okay, the night was viewed as a time of danger. Because it says don't leave until the morning. From there, we learn that in general, you shouldn't leave your house till the morning. Nighttime is a dangerous time in general in those days, right? Remember, there were no street lights. It really was pretty dangerous to walk around, and you shouldn't go out. Now, this goes back to Sugyo we saw. So remember the story where there was the wall and it was falling down, and then they were worried that because of their sins, they were going to get attacked. The wall was going to fall on them. But there's this concept, or the mizikim are going to get out when there's mizikim around, or when there's danger out and about, it kind of comes and attacks you, even though, if it was a good time, you might not have gotten punished for whatever you were doing wrong. But when it's already out and about, it might then come and get you. That even though, right, we generally think, okay, so we do actions, we get rewarded or punished for them. Even though we know it's not that simple either. But there's this other concept, which is when there's destruction going out and about, it could get to anywhere really. So protect yourself. Tanu Rabbanan, dever ba'il kanes raglecha. Here's another bright about this. If there's dever, pestilence in the city, you should go into your houses and watch out for it. Shenemal, vatem. This is also kind of saying, like, don't just rely on God and say, well, that famous joke about, the guy who's there and there's a big flood, and then God brings a helicopter to take him, and he says, no, God will save me. And then he brings a boat, and no, God will save me. And, in the end, he gets up to the heavens and said, God, you didn't save me. He said, what do you mean? I sent you a boat, I sent you a helicopter, I sent you, right, all these things. It's that idea of don't just be silly and, there's danger out there. Just stay there and say, well, I'm protected. No, basically, this can get you anywhere. So, Dever, but you're go in the house. We learned it from that pasuk. It says go in the house because there's going to be danger out there tonight. We're now going to quote 3 pasukim, and then the Gemara is going to say why they need all 3. Come with me, go in your rooms and close the doors, and kind of seal yourselves inside. And it says, outside you will get slain by the sword. And in your houses is fear. So we're going to have to understand what that pasuk means. So why do you need all these 3 pasukim? Maybe it means, look, there might be bad things out there, but don't go out at night because that's when it's the most dangerous. But during the day, you could go out. Obviously, we have to balance this with, you might have to go to the store and get some stuff. So, what if this means literally stay in your houses is a good question. But I think it's just basically trying to say that when there's destruction out there, it doesn't necessarily distinguish between who's good and who's bad. And that's really the idea they're trying to get at. About which, in the middle of a time of war, we can relate to this idea. So you might have thought maybe only at night, because that pasuk, the first pasuk from Makat B'Cholot says don't go out at night. Now, obviously, why I'd say don't go out at night, because Makat B'Cholot happened at night. But you might think, well, maybe in general, it's nighttime where it's more dangerous. But you could go out during the day. Tashma lech ami bo b'chadarecha uskord latecha. Sorry, lech ami. Okay, go my nation, come into your room. Sorry, I read it lech ami. It was wrong. Lech ami. Lock your doors. And that's any time of day. It doesn't say anything about day or night. Now, why do you need the 3rd pasuk where it talks about in the rooms there's fear? Maybe that's only when all the danger is outside, but there's no danger inside, then you go into your houses. But if there's also danger inside the houses, maybe it's better to go among people and be outside among lots of people. Right? It's hard to read this without associating it with the events of October 7th, right? Where it was dangerous outside and it was dangerous inside. And basically what it's saying is keep inside. You're better off inside than going outside. In other words, what it's telling you is even though there's danger inside, outside you'll definitely get killed by the sword. Rabbi when there was a time of anger going around in the world where things were going on, whatever it might be, plagues or other things, he would close his windows. Based on another pasuk, because death has come to our windows. So he said, I better close the windows. By the way, some of this sounds like it could be germs, and protecting from germs. People spoke about, use these sources in Corona, about this idea of go in your houses, right? Keep separated. Tanu Rabbanan, Rav Ba'il Pazer Raglecha. If there's famine in the city, though, that's something different. Then you need to get out of the city and go somewhere else where there's food. otherwise you'll starve. Shene'emar vayhi rav ba'aretz, who also we're going to learn from, vayered Avram Mitzrayim, right? Take it from Avram. He went to Egypt, lagor sham, to live there. Ve'omel, but they also bring other psukim, which again we're going to say why. This is a story of 4 people who were mitzorah. They were leprous. It's in Sefer Melachim. And it talks about they were leprous and they were outside the city. And they said, if we go into the city, there's no food there. We won't be able to get anything. If we stay where we are, there's no food here. We're going to die. Let's go into the camp of the Aramim, okay, our enemies. And look, if they let us live, they'll let us live and they'll give us some food because we know there's food there. And if they kill us, they'll kill us. Okay, but at least, let's say we have a 50-50 chance of surviving. Whereas here, or going back into the city, we have no chance of surviving. So they say that, they quote that pasuk. If we say we go to the city, harab, but we're going to die there, etc. And then, they basically go to the Aramean camp, or they say, let's go to the Aramean camp, and we'll quote the end of the pasuk in a minute. So my Vomer, why do you need that second pasuk? You might say maybe that's only go to a different place, like Avram went to Egypt, and it wasn't life and death threatening situation of him going to Egypt. But maybe if it's, perhaps they'll kill you if you go to the other place, maybe you shouldn't go there. Well, okay, let's go to Machane Aram, and if they let us survive, then great, but knowing, and they don't quote the part that says, matnu, or something like that. And if we die, we die, meaning even if there's a possible danger of death, still, since it's only safek, and you're going to die definitely by not having food, so you should even go to a dangerous place to get food. Tanu Rabbanan, dever ba'il, when there's dever in the city, al yahalech adam be'emtza derech, mipnei shemalach hamavet malech be'emtza drachim. This is interesting. The angel of death, when there's, a lot of people dying, the angel of death, by the way, you can see why this daf would be a corona daf also about, disease being around. The Malach HaMavet walks in the middle of the street, meaning he's got, free reign. He's the king in those days. So basically avoid the middle of the street because that's where the Malach HaMavet is walking. Now, since he has permission, he walks with his head held high right in the middle of the road. Shalom ba'ir, but if there's peace in the city and you don't have disease or things going on, al yahalech b'tzidei drachim, don't walk on the sides. Because that's where when the angel of death doesn't have permission to be pouncing about, he hides on the sides there and therefore avoid the sides of the roads. Again, what this means, whether they're just trying to give you this image of there's 2 times. There's times when the angel of death is kind of let to have free reign, and it's not really God doing things. It's the angel of death that's kind of let free, and he's allowed to rule, and God kind of steps aside. Depends how you view what this angel of death is. Again, also this, I don't have the answers to all these questions. Tanu Rabbanan, dever ba'il, al yikanes adam yachid lebeit hakneset. Don't go alone into a shul. Why is a shul a scary place? Well, in those days, the shuls were more outside the city, or in places that were less inhabited. And therefore, and you'll see in a minute that we're talking about when there's not a lot of people around, shemalach hamavet mafkid sham kelav, because that's where the malach hamavet keeps his equipment. That's only if there's no kids learning there, or there aren't 10 people praying there. But if there's a crowd, then already the malach hamavet isn't there. But when it's empty or empty-ish, then there is. Tanu Rabbanan. Okay, also apropos the dogs that are so useful in the Israeli army. So klavim bochim, if you hear dogs crying, malach hamavet bala'ir, it's a sign that the malach hamavet is there, right? How the dogs warn, they know how to warn, so they warn us. Klavim misachkim, if you see dogs playing, very happy, eliyahu anavi bala'ir, it's a sign that salvation is coming. Behane mile, but they point out this is only there's no female dogs there. If there's female dogs, then these signs don't mean anything because it could just be the playing with the female dogs. Okay. Yativ Rav Ami v'Rav Asi kamed Rabbi Yitzchak Nafra. So these 2 rabbis were sitting in front of Rabbi Yitzchak Nafra. Mar Amar. Okay, now we're kind of done with that section. And now, although we're still going to talk about God and punishing, so we're still in theological. So yeah, but we're going to get off now back to the pasuk about Reish. Okay, we got off about the whole pasuk about Mitzrayim, go basically stay in your houses, and from that we learned about all sorts of situations where you should either stay in your house or alternatively maybe go to a different city. So now these 2 rabbis are sitting in front of Rabbi Yitzchak Nafra. Mar amar le mamar shmatita. One said, please teach me a halacha. Umar amar le mamar agadita. Teach me an agadita. So patach le mamar agadita. He started with agadita. Velo shavit mar, but the other one shut him up and said, no, I want to hear halacha. Patach lememar shmatita velo shavik mar. So he starts saying halacha, and the other one said, no, I want to hear agadita. So he says to them, Amar lahem emshol lachem mashal. A funny mashal, he says, Lema davar domeh la'adam sheyesh lo shtei nashim. Like a man who has two wives, echat yalda ve'echat zkena. One is very young and one is very old. Yaldam laketet lo levano. The older one the younger one is always pulling out all his white hairs. She wants him to look young. Zkenam laketet lo shchorot. And the older one is pulling out the black hairs. Nimtza kereach mikan umikan. So from here, this is a very famous line, to be kereach mikan umikan, he's left without anything, right? He basically goes bald. And this is basically this idea. He's saying, you're not letting me do what I want to do, right? I want to teach, and you're both quieting. So what does he say? Amar lahen, ihachi emelech umilta deshavi l'travaychu. I'll tell you something that will be for both of you. I'll quote one pasuk, an issue with a pasuk, and I'll answer it with an agadata, and I'll answer it with a halach. Ki tetzei eish u'mitza'ah kotzim. So the pasuk starts off, and we talked about this earlier in the Masechet, as if tetzei me'atzma. It goes on its own, right? It kind of sounds like it happened on its own. But then it says shalem shalem hamav'ir tabe'era. But then it says the person who creates the fire has to pay. But it sounded like the fire happened on its own, so there wasn't a creator of the fire. Amar kadosh baruch hu alai l'shalem et habe'era she'iv'alti. This is again back to theology. When the Jews were sent out of Israel, the whole destruction of the temple, it was because of our sins. That's tetzei me'atzma. God didn't cause that. We caused it from our actions. So it kind of happened. But then God also was called the Mav'ir, because he also ignited the fire. So while our actions caused it, God also ignited the fire. Once he ignited the fire, he has to also pay for it, he says, right? Yishalem, shalem, shalem, hamav'ir tabe'era. So God says, Ani hitzaki esh b'tzion, shene'emar vayatzak esh b'tzion v'tachal yesodoteh. I actually did light the fire, but Ani atid livnota be'esh, but I will ultimately build it back through fire, meaning, V'ani ehyeh lecha chomat esh saviv, I will be like a protective fire around you. Ulechavod ehyeh b'tocha, and I will be, right, it will be my glory inside that area that's protected by fire. So in the end, what I used to destroy you, I will use to build you up again. So that's the drasha. And shmatata, here comes the halacha. Patacha katuv b'nizkei mamon v'siyem b'nizkei gufo. And this we learned already. It started by saying, as if just like my shiur went out, my fire went out, as if it wasn't my doing. V'siyem b'nizkei gufo, and as if I'd be responsible because it's my property. But then it ends with, in the end, when you have to pay, it's because hamav'ir, I did it myself. Lomar lecha isho mishum chitzav. And this is the opinion we saw earlier of Rabbi Yochanan, that you're liable on Eish because it's your actions that caused it. That's that. Right? So he took this one pasuk about fire and talked about both a theological position and explanation and a halachic point. Now we get to this story that appears in both in Sefer Shmuel Bet and in Divrei Yamim with some minor differences. The main part we're going to focus in is that in Shmuel Bet, it talks about that there was a field of adashim, of lentils, and in which you're going to say, why is this important? And in the Divrei Yamim, it calls it a field of barley. The question is, it's the same fields, it's two different fields. Why is it called a different field in each place? Often we have these stories that appear both in Shmuel or Melachim and then also appear in Divrei Yamim with differences. And then it's actually not even directly related, like it's mentioned that there's this field, and then it moves on to another story, but the drasha here is going to connect these two stories that are right next to each other in the text. But then David, they're fighting against the Plishtim, and David needs water. So vayitavet David vayoma, mi ashkeni mayim mi bor beit lechem asher basha. Now he says, who's going to give me water from Beit Lechem, which is in the gate? Now, the assumption is he didn't really need water, because of course David had water, or if he wanted water, he didn't have to get it from Beit Lechem. We're going to see the Beit Lechem was where the Plishtim were. It was more like he was saying, wow, I wish I had water. In fact, some of the commentaries say it was where he was from. So he's like, oh, my hometown waters, I wish I had that water. Okay, and notice the word sha'ar is going to appear there, which they're going to darshan to say that it was a halachic question he asked, because the zkanim are in the sha'ar, and he wasn't really looking for water, but water is reflective of Torah. And he was really looking for an answer to a halachic question. Now, what happens in the text? He says, who's going to bring me water? And they go and they bring him water. They go right into the Philistine camp. Okay? And then David gets upset at them and like, why did you endanger yourselves by going into the Philistine camp? Obviously didn't mean that you should go into the Philistine camp and get me water. Well, you think I was going to endanger your lives? And he says, I won't drink this water. And he offers it up to God. Okay? It says, So the question is, what's going on in the story, and what is the Gemara going to do with this story? My kamid ba'ale. So what was the assumption, like I said, is the Gemara is going to immediately assume, what was he asking? Obviously, he had a halachic question. What was his halachic question? We're going to have three interpretations, and then the Gemara is going to analyze each of the three and say, this one works, this one doesn't, this one has this difficulty, etc. I think we'll just get to the three opinions today, and tomorrow we'll start on the ins and outs of them. Amar Rav Nachman. Tamum be'esh kamid ba'ale. Now we know why this story is here. He wanted to know if something hidden in a fire, right? Hidden items that get burnt in a fire, are you liable for them? Ika Rabbi Yehuda, Ika Rabbanan. Do we hold like Rabbi Yehuda? Do we hold like the rabbis? Upashtule, my depashtule. And then they answer what they answered him, and okay. And then, I don't know, maybe he didn't accept their answer because he throws it on the ground. We don't really know. They don't tell us too much about this opinion and why, that was, okay. That's a bit of a less developed opinion here. And again, we'll get back to tomorrow, like, how does that work with this and blah, blah, blah. We'll see. Rav Huna Amal, Gedishim d'Seorim d'Yisrael havu. Now we're going to get back to the fact that it said Seorim and it said Adashim. So according to Rav Huna, because it says in the text there were these piles of barley, they were Jewish piles. Dehavu mitamre plishtim behu. The plishtim were hiding, the Philistines were hiding in these piles. And he wanted to know halachically, can I burn those with the plishtim in them? By the way, this connects with the hiding, you see, right? Can I burn them with the plishtim hiding? And now, there's a debate. And then repay the Jews for what we burned? Or does it mean, can I use it because it's safek nefashot and I don't even have to repay? So the question is either, we don't know really, because the commentaries have a disagreement. Is it, can I burn them and then repay them? Or can I just burn them and not have to repay? Really, you can't do this. But you're a king, and you can do anything you want. Some people say this is only if it's a time of war, and this was a time of war. Some people say in general, a king can do whatever he wants. So you can do it. And then that's why in the end, he says, no. I won't separate myself from everyone else. I won't do something that halachically is problematic for a regular person. And that's his throwing it on, throwing the water out is saying, I don't want your psak. Thank you, but no, thank you. I'm not willing to do something against, what everyone else can do. I won't hold myself on a pedestal and say I have different laws than everyone else. The second version is a little similar to the first. The third version here is a little similar to the second one, different from the first, which was just the asked him a question and got an answer. But this one relates to why there one place it says Seorim and one place Adashim. There were piles of barley that were Jews, and there were piles of Adashim that were Philistines. Now they were in the Philistine camp, the Adashim. So what he asked was the following: well, we need our animals to eat. So can I take the Jews' piles, give it to them to eat, then knowing that after I conquer the Philistines, then I'll return the Philistines' piles and replace the ones that we ate of the Jews. Am I allowed to do that? If a Rasha takes something for collateral, in the end, he has to pay what he stole. Meaning, even though he's going to pay what he stole, he's still called an evil person. Meaning, no, you can't steal and then return. It doesn't work that way. Avalata, but you, melechata, and that's why it's the same as the previous. And again, David doesn't want to have himself separated out, and that's the end of the story where he says, no, thank you. So that's these three versions of the story of David. Tomorrow we'll start analyzing, which works better with the text and which doesn't. So quick review of our daf. We started with the shoteh katan, the guy who gives a flame. Was it a flame? Was it a coal? What the issue is, why he's going to be exempt from in a court of law, even though he will be liable in the heavens. Then we got to the liba and niba and the two different versions of the text. Then we got to what if it's him and the wind together, and then, or she and the wind together. And then we got to, how does this compare to zoreh, where there's, and then we have 4 answers to that in Shabbat. And then we got to all the 4 things mentioned in the pasuk that get burned in the fire and what each one is teaching us, that there's all sorts of things included in Eish, and yet Tamun is going to be exempt possibly if you hold by the rabbis. Then from there we got off on this tangent because of Kitetse Eish Kotzim v'ne'echal gadish. We learned that the tzaddikim, when Poranu come to the world because of Rishaim, because of the Kotzim, right? Kotzim, by the way, I didn't say this. Thorns are a reference to, if I wasn't clear about it, to bad people because they're like thorns. And then the Gadish is the tzaddikim, and then the Gadish is going to actually get eaten first, and then the the Rishaim, and we talked about different ways of grappling with that whole issue. From there, we got off to don't leave your house, protect yourself in time of famine, in time of pestilence, disease. And then we finished that. We got to that story of Rav Ami and Rav Asi who wanted the drasha and the halacha. And then we got into this two explanations of this. The fact that the pasuk starts off as if the fire happened on its own, but then ends with, there's really someone who's ultimately responsible. And that we had the drasha in and also the halacha. And then from there, we got on the story of David with 3 different versions, which we'll come back to in tomorrow's daf. Wishing everybody a good day and hoping for good news today.